Good morning and welcome to the Minneapolis Institute of Art and the Friends Lecture Series. My name is Barbara Proschel and I'm president of the Friends of the Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you've ever wondered about how precious art gets repaired or restored, how the grime of centuries gets removed, or even tears in the canvas gets fixed, our speaker today, Megan Emery, actually does all that. But before we hear from Megan, a word from our sponsor. This lecture series is brought to you by the Friends of the Institute with generous support from the Mark and Mary Goff Fitterman Fund. You'll note up on the screen some upcoming Friends events. Our very popular book club, which is a discussion and tour, will be on Friday. It's usually the third Friday and Saturday of the month, so the 18th and 19th. And the book is Tom Lake by Ann Patchett. We're beginning our 2-week countdown to the perennial favorite, Art in Bloom, which is Thursday through Sunday, the 24th through the 27th. We have many events and many actual ticketed events and free events, and to just come in and view all the gorgeous flowers and floral arrangements is as usual free and open to the public. I just want to note that we have a gala party in Bloom on Friday the 25th, and that is going to be a spectacular Latin-inspired kind of a fiesta or party, very different from some of the other party in blooms we've had in recent years. So you won't want to miss that. On May 15th, that's our May lecture, and we'll start out actually first we have pre-lecture tours for members starting around 5. At 5:45, we have a very brief 10-minute annual report for the Friends. And we'll start the actual lecture at 6 o'clock. And our speaker is Joe Earl, who is going to be joined. He will speak about actually one of our exhibitions that you won't want to miss. It just recently opened, called Transcendent Clay, the Condo Porcelains. So he'll be speaking about that, and then we'll take a brief break, and then we will have actually a panel of speakers that will include Matthew Welch, our chief curator here, and Andreas Marks, who is the curator of that particular exhibition. So please mark that on your calendar for the 15th of May. And now I'd like to introduce Megan Emery. Megan joined the Midwest Art Conservation Center, affectionately known as MAC, in 2013. She is the Chief Conservator and Senior Objects Conservator. Prior to joining MAC, she was Objects Conservator at the Cincinnati Art Museum. Megan has held fellowships and internships at the National Museum of the American Indian, the Walters Art Museum, and the Poggio Colo Archaeological Field School. Megan enjoys working on all types of materials, especially decorative arts and objects from indigenous and world cultures. She has extensive experience in the management of large-scale conservation projects, including monumental sculpture and murals. Megan received her Master of Arts in Art Conservation from the Buffalo State's Garment Art Conservation Department. So please help me welcome Megan Emery to the stage.
Thank you very much. It is an absolute pleasure to be here today, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak. Today, I'm going to start with an overview of what conservation is, including just sort of an overview of the profession with a focus on what the organization MAC, the Midwest Art Conservation Center, is and where we're located secretly downstairs in the basement, and a little bit about what we do in more specifics. Starting with what is conservation. Conservation, defined by our professional organization, the American Institute for Conservation, is it encompasses all actions taken toward long-term preservation of cultural heritage. The four main factors that are really important in that are the examination, documentation, treatment, and preventive care of all cultural heritage material. We used to just refer to it as art, but it's really become a much more expanded definition as time goes on. Many people ask, why are we conservators and not restorers, when the traditional or more historic term was to be a restorer? On the screen, you have some of the actual technical dictionary definitions, but really what is important here is the emphasis on those four key things that were in our professional definition: examination, documentation, preventive care, education, scientific analysis. We do a lot more. We delve a little bit deeper into a work of art, and we really try to pay close attention on any of the work that we do and interact with a work of art is looking at the long-term preservation in the best possible way, which may involve reversibility, choosing the materials so that they don't have a similar solubility as what's there, and all of this will be touched upon more as we go through the presentation. Beginning with our professional code of ethics. This is one of the very first things that really truly distinguishes us from restorers. Our professional organization, already mentioned, the American Institute for Conservation, we have a code of ethics, very much like a medical code of ethics or a codex that we follow very closely. And really the goal of this is to make sure that we are kind of taking a do no harm approach. We really want to make sure that anytime we interact with an entire collection of material or an individual object, that we are taking into consideration the materials present, the artist's intent, the historic history of an object, all the different factors, not just making a piece look the best it's supposed to look at a certain point in time. So all of these things kind of come together. And the other thing that's really important to note about what we do is that we treat all artwork with the exact same care. It could be a Picasso or a Rembrandt hanging in a major museum, or it could be an item your great-grandfather made hiding in your closet. We will give it the exact same care. The other thing a lot of times people ask us is if we do appraisals, and that is sort of looking at a work of art and understanding what its value is. That actually goes against our code of ethics. We do not appraise works of art. We can look closely at a work of art and examine it and understand its history, the materials it's made out of, how it was made, but we don't want to actually put any value on it because we, as a conservators, treat all works equally. So we put the same value at stake. So we won't do anything with monetary value because we will treat those items the exact same. Next thing I'll address is how to become a conservator, a common question. All of the conservators at the Midwest Art Conservation Center have a master's degree. The programs have changed over time, so it's either a Master's of Fine Arts or a Master's of Science or a Master's of Arts and Science, depending on the program. But the specific focus is a certificate in advanced study of art conservation. In order to go into one of the master's programs, individuals have to have a background in art history, studio art, an intensive background in chemistry, and extensive experience working in the field of conservation. Used to be more of a volunteer-based. Luckily now internships are more likely to be paid. But it's a lot of prerequisite work to get into the graduate schools. There are 3 main programs in the United States that address all specialties. There's one at Buffalo State College where I attended. There's one at New York University. There's one at the University of Delaware in Winterthur. There's also a program at UCLA through the Getty that only focuses on 3-dimensional objects. Those other programs in the United States address all of the main specialties of paintings, paper, objects, textiles, and preventive conservation. Again, all of those specialties will be touched upon more as we go. So now coming to the Midwest Art Conservation Center and who we are in specifics. The Midwest Art Conservation Center is a Minneapolis-based nonprofit organization downstairs in the basement of MIA, and we have been ever since we initiated in 1977. For over 45 years, MAC has served vital needs of hundreds of government entities, museums, historical societies, natural history collections, libraries, archives, artists, and the conservation and restoration of their important cultural assets. MAC is one of only a few nonprofit centers in the United States. the work we do at MAC, especially of all of our educational and outreach activities, which I'll also touch on as we go, about a third of our funding comes from private grants, NEH funding, used to, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We also accept private donations. So a lot of the work we do as a nonprofit is really, it's important that we have a lot of that access to grant funding. Conservation staff is led by Colin Turner, our executive director, who happens to be in the audience today. And then we have 10 conservators on staff, plus we also have a group of administrative support. We have a registrar, we have a business manager, we always have a large host of interns and fellows who are also working with us. We are governed by a board of directors. Nancy Huart, our board chair, is also in the audience today, so I'm very glad that she's here. But our board of directors is composed of both museums, individuals from museums and some of the institutions we serve, but also from the more corporate and public side, people who really have a passion and dedication for caring for long-term the cultural assets that our society holds. When MAC was first formed in 1977, our name was actually the Upper Midwest Conservation Association, UMCA for short. However, over time, Upper Midwest no longer really worked for our organization, so we became the Midwest Art Conservation Center. However, today, this is sort of a general spread of just the continental United States that we reach. We are expanding farther and farther as the needs of small institutions, tribal cultural centers, and other collections are in need of conservation services. So we really have a very broad range throughout the United States. I don't expect you to be able to read a single thing on this screen. However, what's important is that this is a list from 2024 of more than 560 cultural collecting institutions that we served. This does not include any of our private or corporate clients. However, it ranges from county historical societies, colleges, universities, religious institutions, tribal cultural centers, large museums. I mean, the Guggenheim and MIA are on this list. However, then there are also things like, I'm just trying to see, like Iowa Falls Historical Society, the Joslin Art Museum in Omaha, Owatonna Arts Center. I mean, the list goes on of the size of the type of scope we work on. So it's really a broad range of collections that we touch. Now we're going to get into a little bit more of the specifics of the different characters who work and live downstairs in the basement and very rarely get invited to come up, so this is great. We have 5 different departments at MAC outside of the administrative offices. And this is just kind of a quick glance at our paintings conservation lab. And the paintings conservation lab has 3 full-time paintings conservators on staff and frequently also a host of interns and fellows in their lab. And the paintings lab works on traditional and modern canvas paintings, panel paintings, and other 2-dimensional painted works of art. The Objects Conservation Lab, my personal home where I spend most of my time, we have also 3 conservators on staff, full-time conservators on staff, who work on anything 3-dimensional. So frequently the joke downstairs at MAC is if someone's not really sure which area it is, it's always an object and we always get it. What that means is that it could be decorative art, it could be ancient, it could have a cultural heritage significance, it could be protest art, it could be large-scale monumental outdoor sculpture, it could be a mural, it could be something that falls in the gray area. Any material, glass, metal, furniture, painted surfaces, stone, this is just kind of a host of some examples. For example, this image here is my colleague Megan Randall underneath the Quadriga sculpture on the top of the state capitol. We've got us working on tiny jewelry. This is a piece of jewelry in Mia's collection from, working on Roman sarcophagi and Henry Moore bronze sculptures. So a very broad range of materials in sizes and shapes. It made me look because that's the same ringtone I have for someone and I was like, oops. Paper conservation lab. We have 2 full-time conservators in the paper lab, which is actually very exciting because we just welcomed a new conservator on staff, Cornelia Bowers, as of April 1st. So it's nice to have a full house in paper again. And they work on all materials on paper. So that could be prints, drawings, watercolors, archival documents, photographs, and occasionally books. We have a textile conservator on staff who spends a lot of time with different fashion arts, quilts, tapestries, flags, samplers, and all sorts of unique modern materials that are heavily based on fiber. And then we have our 5th conservation department, which is preventive conservation, led by our Director of Preventive Conservation, Nicole Grabo. The preventive conservation department, so as I've gone through these different departments, we all work on individual objects. However, we also all contribute to the preventive conservation that we do at MAC. But what the preventive conservation department really focuses on is, instead of looking at an individual object and its care and condition, they really focus on looking at an institution or collecting institution as a whole and how to best preserve collections long term. Some of the things that we talk about as agents of deterioration are light, temperature, humidity, pest management, biological attack, use and handling, and also emergency preparedness. Some of these things are becoming more and more important. While they always have been critical in the long-term preservation of artwork, as our environment and our climate is changing, museums are seeing more and more disasters and more changes and fluctuations in their environment. All of these things needed to be mitigated and controlled, and we're really trying to focus now on doing that in a very sustainable way that works best for both the environment going back, but also for the objects long term. So the Preventive Conservation Department spends a lot of time working with institutions, going in, doing large surveys, understanding what type of materials they have in their collection, what is their HVAC system like, what is their light levels, how much natural light is there. So this is where the science that we have comes in. So there's a lot of understanding of how materials interact, how they age, how they deteriorate over time. The other thing is that we do a lot of emergency preparedness and helping institutions plan and prepare. We do workshops and different types of lecture series that help them understand how to plan ahead for these things, in addition to just how to address those things in their collection now. The Preventive Conservation Department also has a very extensive training program and educational component that is also, this is where a lot of the grant funding really is significant for MAC and how we can do our outreach. In the fact that we can do anything from workshops on museum lighting, pest management, care of paintings, and in this example alone, you see a large tour coming through the MAC Conservation Labs. Here we've got a tour in the Objects Lab. We offer tours to university students, high school classes, art organizations. I believe some of the friends have had tours of MAC before, and other donors and individuals who are really interested in education and understanding more about what we do in the world of conservation. Here you also have an example of showing you some of the extremes of the type of work we're doing, is Nicole Grabo actually giving a lecture to a group of National Reservists who are being ready to be deployed to Poland, talking really about understanding the care of works of art in conflict zones. So we're starting to see a very different direction. We do a lot with protest art. We've had a very active enrollment. Supporting those who are caring for the George Floyd Memorial. So we have kind of this deep role helping others care for their own collections, not just coming in and saying that we're going to do the work, but really supporting those crucial individuals who are in the field working to save cultural heritage. And then a much more specific workshop where Olivia Thandabout, our current conservation public coordinator or public education coordinator, is teaching a very specific workshop on how to care for silver in Hmong jewelry, and looking specifically at the type of silver that was used in Hmong artworks, and teaching a workshop on that. As I mentioned, we have a lot of fellowships. Other things that our grant funding allows us to do is host Native American Fellows in Collections Care. We've had a long-standing program supported by the Mellon Foundation for different types of community collaboration workshops and fellowships and interns. We also have them graduate student internships in the different conservation labs. So we have a wealth of students and young individuals excited about the field of conservation coming through our lab on a regular basis. Now we're going to go back to the labs where we focus on individual things and get more a little nitty-gritty about those individual works of art as well. Again, coming back to that definition between a conservator and a restorer, there's some of these detailed parts that I mentioned, examination and documentation, that are really critical in the work that we do. And the reason why we spend a lot of time when a work of art comes to the conservation lab for treatment or for us to examine it, the very first thing we want to do is understand what its condition is, but why is it important? Who is the artist? What are the materials that it was made out of? What is its cultural or artistic historical significance? We also want to understand scientifically what are the products on the market that we use to interact with a work of art, and what are technologies in the world that we can use to better care for works of art and understand scientifically materials and how they interact with one another. I'll kind of talk a little bit about this, but one example is, for instance, if we have an oil painting in the paintings conservation lab and there are areas of lost paint, they would not use oil paint to fill in that area of loss because it would have the same solubility as the original and you wouldn't be able to reverse it in the future. So that kind of ties into the scientific understanding of the materials, our code of ethics, and our kind of general sense of not doing any harm. When we examine a work of art, we spend a lot of time looking at it in different layers. Visually with our eyes is the most common way we're going to examine something, and we document that through photography. We also use UV illumination, ultraviolet illumination. We use kind of diving into the wavelength spectra. We look at infrared radiation and we look at X-ray radiation. These are different techniques that allow us to see deeper and kind of ties that science into what we're doing, understanding more about an object and its condition. Here is an example of some of the documentation we may take using some of these. This is visible light, and you have one painting. This is the same vision of the same painting. You have an example of just in standard light. You can see how much damage there is. This is when you take raking light, where the photographer is shooting the light from one direction across the surface. This is specular, where it's reflecting off of the front. And this is transmitted, where the light is coming through the back. So you can see this one painting before treatment, all these different light sources and ways of visualizing and documentation and examining gives us very different information about its current condition, why it's so important. And to contrast it, here you can see during treatment, after all the planar deformations have been addressed, and after all of the inpainting has been addressed, and a before and an after of the specular light of how that painting changed through the course of treatment. All taking into consideration the fact that the materials used are the best for long-term preservation. Here's an example of a three-dimensional object looking at ultraviolet illumination and X-radiography as examples. This is a sand porchere where it's a salt cellar. There's only about 80 known of these sand porchere wares left in the world. And this is a small salt cellar, and here it is in visible light, and it looks like it is in excellent condition. There was a few indications that there may have been old repairs. Looking at it under ultraviolet illumination, all of a sudden you can clearly see all the areas of repair marked by a different fluorescence from the adhesive that's currently on the surface. Looking at the X-radiography, all of a sudden you can see in small areas, here's a crack through the ceramic, and here you can see a metal pin that's been inserted into the object. These are all things that you can't see with your naked eye, and why it's important for us to do scientific analysis and examination. We don't do this for every work of art that comes through the lab, but we do it when there is either something suspicious or we have a curatorial request. A lot of times we'll work with the curators here at MIA, looking deeply into an object and how it's made and looking more at this analysis to try to understand more about its history and the types of repair. But when we know this information, it also really influences how we go forward with treatment. Here's an example of infrared, and this is where we can actually look through paint layers and see, and similar, X-radiography does this too, but X-ray kind of takes it farther and looks more at structure, whereas infrared, this is looking, here you have a panel painting, and so looking at it with infrared, not only can you see the seam lines of all the panel sections of wood, but you can also see this is all underdrawing. So the artist in this case did a very detailed drawing on the preparation layers before it was painted. And a lot of that detail is then lost underneath the paint layers. This allows us to see artist changes, areas of restoration that have taken place over time, areas of old loss. Now what I'm going to do with the remainder of the time I have before we get to any questions is walk through the paintings lab, paper lab, and the objects lab and give you a brief example of one treatment, sort of start to finish. This is a painting by the Mexican artist Alfredo Ramos Martinez from 1929 called Flores Mexicanas. It was actually a gift to Charles Lindbergh and his wife at their wedding from a government official in Mexico. Her family, his wife's family, had a connection there. And it is a large-scale painting. You'll see a little later on, but it is probably about 9 feet long by about 6 or 7 feet tall. So it's a fairly substantial, or 6 feet tall, it's a fairly substantial painting. And here you can see the before treatment, front and reverse. This is an examination where we did the visible light and ultraviolet. And what we learned is you've got the normal visible light versus the ultraviolet, same with these details. And you can see the different colors and the streakiness. A lot of that is different layers of varnish and resins that were applied and manipulated, some of it with other paint inside, to kind of cover up old areas of damage. There was actually also, if you noticed, her chest is very dark and smeary. There was a lot of overpaint trying to hide her breasts, so that they were trying to change the composition a little bit to make it more appropriate for wherever it was at one point in its history. And so there was a lot of changes that were made throughout the composition, and that happened during times of restoration, not by the artist himself. In addition to looking at some of those issues, the painting also had structural problems. So one of the very first things that was done in the lab, and again, you can see 4 people, you can see, get a scale of the size here, but they did a dry surface cleaning, but they also had to address structural issues. The canvas was very friable, very fragile, and that usually that tacking margin where it gets attached to the stretcher or the strainer is very brittle and degraded. So they had to work on strengthening that. They repaired small tears. Barbara's introduction mentioned tear repair, so I don't usually do it on canvas paintings. I'll do it on other types of objects, but here you can see a very detailed where they actually line up the individual fibers within the canvas weave and reset them back down with a very small heated spatula and tool. And then they also applied did what's called a strip lining, where they go around and around that tacking margin that's very brittle and deteriorated, they reinforce it with another layer of canvas. Here you can see them preparing it with adhesive and then setting in that additional layer to actually support. And what that does is allow them to properly tension and stretch the painting without harming the original canvas and also not covering and invading the painting any more than necessary. Then they re-stretch it, and so here you can see on the new the liner that is what is being stretched around the surface, cutting off extra fabric. They temporarily tack it in place with pins so they can make sure it's properly aligned before they go ahead and staple it together. Here's an example of that surface cleaning. A lot of this loose surface cleaning is done before some of those structural treatments, but then it gets more detailed cleaning as the process goes on. So this is just an example of the kind of grime that you can find on a museum painting. That's pretty typical of what we see, especially institutions that, and many of them had originally been heated with coal. Here is getting into more of the deep aesthetic cleaning, and you can actually see this line of the grime layer that's being removed. So here, this is uncleaned, and this is cleaned, and see how dirty the swab tips are. People are fascinated by the fact that we roll our own cotton swabs. I'm not sure why it's fascinating, but we do. We like bamboo skewers and loose cotton, and we sit and roll them, and we can do hundreds and hundreds of swabs. So, but we like to do that because we can determine pre-made cotton swabs have a very specific density, size, and shape, and it's also a lot of waste. So we like to do it this way so we can get the right fluffiness, the right size. So sometimes they use small ones, sometimes they're teeny tiny. So sometimes I'll put them on a toothpick. So here you have kind of a before and during. So here you can just see how drastically the colors shifted just simply from cleaning the surface and re-stretching it and tightening it and getting it so that it's all in planar dimension. And then, so you can also see that some of that streakiness, a lot of that was in the ultraviolet image, but a lot of it cleaned up and became more noticeable. The details in the painting became more noticeable. Then the next step is filling any areas of loss, and so that if there's a loss that goes down to the canvas, that it's in plane with the existing paint layer, and then in painting it. I mentioned at one point overpaint, and that is a term that we use and that happened a lot with a lot of older restorations and older conservation treatments in the past, where it was easier to cover a large area of damage with paint than it was to just address the tiny small loss. It can be easier to pick a new color and kind of smear it into the sky than it can be to sit and color match each little speck of the thing. We don't overpaint, we only inpaint, which means we just apply new material to that very tiny area of loss. So here you can see, we use teeny tiny brushes on very large paintings. We color mix our own colors, we use different materials. Again, they're not using oil paint, they're using dry pigments in a medium that is very different solubility than the original surface. And here you can see the before and the after treatment with the colors and the saturation really shifting and changing. And the back, because this one got a new stretcher that properly supported it, and we give it a bit more durability over time. And lastly, in its original frame, which I did the conservation of the frame. So I had to show you what the frame looked like, even though I'm not going to talk about it, but frames are one of my things. So going to the paper conservation to see a totally different side of what what we can do and how materials can be manipulated. Here is a sort of a small Henry Matisse relief print on paper. And this is the before. We always do front and back because condition issues can be very different on each side. And here's sort of more of a detail of some of the corners where you can start to see what some of the problems are. There was masking tape all around the tape. Paper conservators hate tape. It's just something to know. Paintings conservators don't like it. Objects conservators, we find we need to use it quite a bit, but stable tapes and not long term. The paper was skinned, meaning there had been in old areas of hinges where there was actually loss and thinning of the paper. There was extensive light damage where things had faded and darkened. Here you can see on the back this foxing where there's this kind of speckly, kind of irony, mildewy pattern on the back. And also this is matte burn where you had a window mat and the light exposure of the window mat, you can see that darkened. This paper was protected from light and this was not. So sometimes people assume things are always fading, but sometimes they're darkening as well. So you really do have, and if you go back to see the before here, you can see it overall, the before. You can see that burn around the whole edge. Treatment, paper is a magical thing. I love going into the paper lab and seeing what Diana and Cornelia are working on because it's a very, and I don't try this at home, but they can actually wash paper sometimes depending on the solubility of the inks. And so they did the tape removal. They worked on removing old adhesive from old hinges and areas that have been damaged. And they actually, after testing the solubility of the printing inks, they were able to wash it in very thin baths, reducing that stain discoloration and reducing the matte burn. Then they can also we have something that's called a suction table. It's a large table with perforated holes and a vacuum suction, so they can actually apply solvents and liquids and pull it through the paper to work locally and really address some of these things. And here is after treatment. So you can see how much cleaner the paper looks, how it's regained more of its original color and got taken away a lot. The foxing is significantly reduced. There will always be some discoloration. However, you can see that the matte burn has been pretty much removed. In very close light, you can see it. And the conservator added proper paper hinges to the back to set it properly in its new window mat made out of acidic-free materials. And there again, you have before and after treatment. Now we're going to step into my home from a small little object that I've worked on in the not so distant past. This is an alabaster mourning, or it's a pair of alabaster mourning figures from the 14th century, and it's from France. And they would have originally been installed on a sarcophagi or in a tomb structure, sort of in different ornamental features. And they were carved, and you have one individual who is holding a rosary and one who is holding a small book. And they are, you've got this person crying and they're just in mourning. They would have originally not been on a stand. They would have been actually attached to a larger ornamental structure. And they came to the lab for several reasons. Here's some of the condition issues that you can see more clearly. It was evidence of old cracks and losses and some breaks. These bases were non-original and they were applied, they were steel bases that not only did they not look very nice anymore, but they were attached in a very aggressive way to the bottom of the sculpture and were more risk for damage of the sculpture itself than having them on there. And then there was a very heavy layer of dirt and grime on the surface of them. Looking at it in ultraviolet illumination, we were able to see that there was a much more damage present than what initially met the eye, including extensive damage in the past that had been repaired. This is a great example of overpaint. So here you can see that the object had broken in half, and instead of just toning out the crack, they just repainted the whole section, similar to the neck. And I'll talk a little bit more of this as we go, but these areas on the back, originally there were cavities on the back that would have been used in the original mounting. Those had been completely filled and hidden. So part of the treatment was to actually address this crack and to reverse all of that overpaint so more of the original surface was visible. In the process of removing the paint, then you got to actually see how small that crack was. That overpaint on this covered this entire section. Here you can see the plaster that was covering actually a fragment of wood that had once been used as a bridge, but also at some point people had added metal staples. And the metal staples started to deteriorate and were causing iron staining to both the alabaster and the fill material, causing discoloration. So all of this was fully reversed and completely taken apart, including that the head was reversed and there was a metal pin in the head as well. And then it was all put back together without any additional pins, only using proper adhesives that would both work long-term with the alabaster and not have any negative effect, but also provide the right amount of strength long-term. And here you can see them after treatment off of their stands with their cavity originally for hanging fully visible and fully, there's just in paint, no overpaint. So only the cracks are filled on these. Unfortunately, I don't have a detail of that. And there again, you have the before and after treatment details. So that is what I have for my formal presentation. I would love to answer any questions. I know that Colin Turner, our executive director in the audience, would also be happy to answer any questions. So please feel free to ask away. Yes. Hi, Nancy.
Hi. You mentioned that when you restore or you conserve a painting, you don't use oil paint. You use something different so that it can be taken back if you need to. Can you explain why that would be necessary?
Absolutely. So the question about reversibility is really important, and the fact that whenever we're looking at an object, whether it's an oil painting or any other type of material, if we're going to introduce a new paint, adhesive, something to the surface, we want to make sure that in the future it can come off safely. So that, because inevitably, I would say the majority of the work that we do has been, most of the objects that we see have been conserved or restored in their life. Restoration, conservation has been a very long history. As soon as art was made, somebody was fixing it. And so over time, a lot of times what happened was if you use the same material, if you use oil paint on top of oil paint, they have the same chemical solubility. You cannot remove the non-original from the original. And that was really important when you had the factor of the fact that they were overpainting and covering original. Even when we're only filling those areas of loss, we want the future conservators who are inevitably going to have to work on these things again in 30, well, we like to say, 35, 50, 100 years down the road, even if it's in 2 years for some reason, we want them to be able to easily remove the non-original material without damaging the original. We frequently find works of art where there is so much non-original material on artwork that we can't safely take off, that we can never retrieve that original surface. So sometimes we have to work with that. So that's why we always try to use materials that are reversible whenever possible. Yes?
I have two questions that aren't related to each other. When an exhibit is coming to, like our museum, are you guys super busy with any repair or cleaning?
So that's an interesting question. We are here in MIA, but we are a completely separate entity. And so while we do work with exhibitions, a lot of times when there's a big exhibition being planned of material that's in MIA's collection, we will talk about with the curators, or when the galleries are renovated and new objects are put out. A lot of times we will be asked to look at those works of art with the curator and propose any conservation. So sometimes we do. A lot of times the artwork that is coming to us is going on an exhibition somewhere, but we're not really involved in the big picture of the exhibition. However, when all of the traveling exhibitions that come, for instance with Giants, we were active in the galleries helping when they needed a conservator on site for something. There was various cases where, either a piece is particularly problematic and always need little bits of treatment, or they wanted a conservator's eye, not just a registrar's eye. So we do get involved with exhibitions, and a lot of the work we do is driven by exhibitions, but not usually. Not usually, but then it happens. Sometimes we'll do 40 pieces for one exhibition, but usually it's one or two.
My other question is, with all the procedures that you do, has your group ever invented something new in conservation or research?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think it's hard to say yes, we have. Oh, yes. I was just going to mention that. One of the examples, so the American Institute for Conservation, our professional organization, is actually going to be hosting its annual meeting here in Minneapolis at the end of May. And at that conference, I'll be presenting a talk on a project that we did. And also Megan will be presenting a poster, which is also a small paper, on a technique that she has developed it's for polishing silver. One of the problems with polishing silver, this is a big topic, but I'll make it simple. It's a method for polishing silver that does not involve getting anything wet. So for instance, one of the Sound of Music puppets was at MAC recently, and it was the Prince. I don't have a picture, but it had a German silver kind of necklace that had all these little dangles, but it was also on top of a velveteen costume, and I couldn't actually polish those bells without damaging the costume by using traditional polishing methods. And so she developed a method of using calcium carbonate, embedding it in silicone, and using that to like an eraser. So yes, we do develop things. However, she also had originally gotten that idea from somebody who thought they might try it, and so we do contribute to the field, is the short answer. Yes.
Do you ever decline conservation on a piece of art? And what would be your grounds to do that?
Very rarely. However,
I guess that.
Yeah. I can think of several examples. Just recently, we declined to work on human remains. It was a request for some conservation, and we decided that we did not feel comfortable at this time taking any human remains into the labs. Another example would be there have been a few cases where something is, I wouldn't say we declined it, but something has been so badly damaged or would be so difficult to repair that we suggested that a lot of times this has happened with modern and contemporary art, where we suggest they talk to the artist about some of these problems, because the work would be so invasive it would never look right again, and it would almost be better to start over. So it's rare that we turn something away. It has to be a very specific case, but there are things that we will do repairs on that may never. Our goal is to make it look whole and intact for that time period, for whatever the visual intent is supposed to be. And there are times where that's not possible, but we will a lot of times do the conservation work just to make it a whole, make it a representation of itself as close as possible.
I've been at MAC for a long time, longer even than Megan, and it is very rare that it happens. But I do recall once an individual came in and they wanted us to remove a painting that an artist had put on top of their own painting, and they wanted the one that was visible removed so that they could have the painting underneath it, which had some value in some particular manner. But we would not do that because that was the artist's intent, was to paint a new painting on top of the old painting. And so that would be against the artist's intent, and that's something we wouldn't do. So it's rare that that an owner doesn't really defer to conservation, but the conservation AIC kind of code, but it does happen from time to time.
Got more questions up front. I don't know where the microphones are. Yes.
How much,
Oh, there's somebody with the microphone quick.
apologize, how much emphasis, if any, do you put on publications by your conservators?
Well, because we're a small regional conservation lab, our focus is really heavy on education, outreach, and treatment. So when we do, like, the conservators do research and they do publish. In fact, one of the objects conservators is currently the co-editor of a major conservation publication on plant materials, the preservation of plant materials, and one on different treatments of leather and hide, including her specialty was fish skins. So, I mean, we do publish. It is not, we are not a research-based organization. So it's a side piece we do, like the talk I'll be giving at our professional conference is about the conservation treatment we did for the George Morrison mural on the side of the Minneapolis American Indian Center. And that will be a published paper at the end. However, I'm really not going for it for the publication factor, but more of sharing the knowledge of the community collaboration and the work that we did on that project. So we do publish, but it's not a huge emphasis. But it is something that we do. I'll kind of work for the people who have microphones. Otherwise, they're like a bunch in the front row, and there's another one in the middle.
Well, you mentioned snakeskins. Do you collaborate with the staff at the Bell Museum? They recently opened a major restoration of their collection.
We do occasionally work with the Bell Museum. In fact, we worked on their move from the old building to the new building. We were the team that did the mural conservation of the Jacques murals. All of those murals that are in the new building had been previous, and we helped disassemble them, move them, and put them back together again. So we do work with the Bell Museum as one of our clients. We have not worked with them more recently, unless sometimes they'll have small paintings or small objects that will come in, and we'll work with them on that. So yes, we do. Yeah, Tom.
Yeah, my understanding is repatriation is a big issue in the art world these days, and I'm wondering, do you ever get asked to become involved in the efforts to repatriate pieces, say, from one country to another, and in what way are you guys involved in that?
That's a really important topic in our field right now, and something that MAC is actually very involved in. And we're involved in several different levels. So some of this, I mean, I could talk to you about like 10,000 different things. I just tried to give you an overview, but so we have a team of conservators. Both Nicole, our Director of Preventive Conservation, and Courtney Murray, one of the objects conservators, are very active in working on defining parameters for pesticide and hazardous materials that are present on objects being repatriated. So they are looking at standardizing the testing procedures. A lot of times in collections, there are materials, ethnographic cultural materials, that have been treated with harmful pesticides, mercury, arsenic, lead, that are very human toxic. And it is important when objects are repatriated to communities, a lot of times they want to put those objects back into active use and have them as a ceremonial context. So we are frequently the middleman who helps talk about to both sides about what kind of hazards need to be addressed and what kinds of limitations there are to treatment. It is very difficult to remove those pesticides to bring them down to non-harmful levels. So we have a lot of different cases where that comes in. And I would say that we also, there's a lot of other things we do with repatriation, but that is one small aspect, and we're kind of in the team that's leading the forefront of some of the research of making these, making more consistent standards so we can make it easier for the tribal communities to, and other communities receiving their material back to understand the health concerns. So that's just one piece of how we are involved with repatriation, but we could go on and on about that topic. Oh, this is a Chihuly in Manhattan, Kansas, and it was surface cleaned. So that's just a picture of me surface cleaning a Chihuly. They're not actually very easy to clean, so especially when they're in a spiral staircase. So, yeah.
My question has to do with when the color of the paint changes through time. Do you just leave it as a new color? I know that reds, for example, can fade. Van Gogh paintings change color. You don't do anything to the color.
Once an object has deteriorated to the point of losing some of its original color or some of those original components have changed, we do not interfere. That would be trying to, part of the story of the piece, part of the artist's materials. Van Gogh is a great example. There have been many Van Gogh paintings where purple flowers are now white or yellow sunflowers are now brown. And what's happening is that's the way the artist manipulated different types of pigment with different types of medium and the way they chose to work. And sometimes the artists even knew that these things were problematic, and they were okay with it because they achieved an effect. For us to go in and redo that would be deceiving the viewer of what something has become. It would remove some of that. What we are doing is, this is where technology comes into the field a lot, and a lot of it's the didactics. A lot of times what we can do is we can do scientific analysis to figure out what color would have been where, what it should have been, and we can map that out and then produce that in digital reproductions. So we could, a lot of times I've seen an example, I'm using Van Gogh because you mentioned it, but where it was, a didactic where you could flip on an iPad screen and see, okay, this is what the painting looks like, this is what it would look like if it hadn't faded or hadn't gone through these changes. But we really try not to, that falls more into the restore, bringing it back to the very original, which we try to really understand what it is currently and what its history has been.
My question is, I'm fascinated just looking at the Chihuly picture there. Are you ever afraid to touch one of the objects that's brought to you? And I guess it's just maybe a larger question is, what is the personality of your team? Are you all just calm? Because most of us in this room wouldn't do this, right?
It would be interesting. I will tell you my answer. It would be interesting to see if Colin disagrees or if Nancy disagrees. So the short answer for something like the Chihuly and touching, there are times where you look at something. We spend a lot of time looking before we touch. And the reason is that we are very comfortable with a wide range of materials and a wide range of really fragile, delicate things. But we want to understand what we're getting into before we begin. So we do spend a lot of time looking for fragile spots, looking for areas of damage. And every single object that comes to the lab is treated as its individual object. We never have the same exact treatment plan for two objects. Everything is customized to that thing because it has its own needs. So yes, there are times where we're hesitant, especially objects that come in that are completely falling apart, because we would like to get through the exam without causing anything else to fall off. But we're also trained in this, and we all have a lot of experience, so we're very comfortable and we are not driven by fear. Personality-wise, I would say each department has its own personality traits, meaning it takes a different type of conservator to work on paper than it does to work on objects. I think we all have we're a very happy group. We love work. We love what we do. That's the number one thing about us. You can probably tell I'm pretty passionate about this field. I love all of the aspects of it. We all love what we do. We all want to be at MAC. We all love working at MAC. We all love being in MIA. And but it is a personality trait of, as an objects conservator, I'm a lot dirtier most of the time. This is in my clean form. I'm usually in jeans and crawling around on my knees in the lab, or up on scaffolding, you know, getting hot and sweaty, doing whatever, wearing face masks or Tyvek suits. The paper conservators are very delicate, and they sit at their very clean, small space, and they work very quietly and are always listening to the news while we're listening to some obnoxious pop song. So there is some differences in our personalities. The paintings conservators are paintings conservators. Paintings are the great art. So but I mean, it is. We have a lot of fun, and we have different personality types. So yes. Oh, I see one more question here. You guys have good questions.
Just wondering what your most challenging piece to conserve was, and what about it made it so challenging?
Depends on the day. That's a hard one. I think sometimes the challenging ones are the ones. It's not always the most difficult treatment. It's not always the ones that require the most time and thought and process. It's the ones that should be very straightforward but just don't want to work the way it's supposed to. Actually, down in the lab right now, I have a piece that's finished, finally. It's a French roll top secretariat desk, and it's a private client, and they really wanted it functioning again. And the roll top itself has been frozen in a mid position for the last 15 years, and it won't budge. And I have spent a great deal of time making it work. And I did it during the winter months, and it is drier in the winter months. And the other day I tested it, and it was stuck again. So it's a case where, I mean, part of it had to do with removing original material it had warped. It's complicated, but it's not necessarily a hard problem. It was just, it took a lot of thought and patience and time, and it's hard because you don't want to change anything about the original, but sometimes to make it function again, I had to get rid of original material. Now it's all in the track, it's all hidden, you can't see it, but I know I'm taking something original off. But I also know that it wasn't made as well as it could have been made, and it had warped. So, but I think that it has to do with the fact that we can't always make things. We are constantly reminding ourselves that better is the enemy of good, because we can always want to do better and make it look better. But there's a point at which we can't go back, and we need to remember to stop and, talk to curators, talk to our clients, talk to the owner, and make sure we're in good communication about what is best long term, because we want to make things look great, but it's not always possible. So we have to balance that. So, all right. Any other questions? Otherwise, I think we're right on time. Oh, one more.
Do the ravages of time sometimes contribute to the character of the piece? And one of your last slides showed before and after that one, but if you go to the last picture of it.
This one?
Yeah, before treatment to me has a lot more character than the washed out appearance of after treatment.
Yeah. I can understand that. Part of that has to do with the lighting in the image. In person, it was actually quite a bit different, because it went from being, alabaster is a very kind of translucent, white, you see a lot of layers and depth. And so a lot of what you're seeing on the first one is the loss of transparency, because you're seeing that thick layer of dirt and grime on the surface, which means it is more of a flat, it had more shadow and contrast, but it was flat and it lost. So what is hard to translate in images sometimes is the depth and the play of light and shadows and the translucency that was found. So sometimes images are always tricky because it's hard to see that. It's better in person. But I do understand, even when I had these up there, I was like, it's not a great example of before and after, but whatever. But it is sometimes there are many cases where we're not making, even when I say we want it to be better, where we're not saying we want it to look perfect. We address each type of work of art specifically. So for instance, I happen to have Sitting Bull's headdress downstairs in the lab right now. And that is an object that has a very important history. It has a lot of damage and deterioration that is part of the piece. It will never look like a new headdress. It will always look like it has been through the time and the age it has. But the goal is to make it clean of museum or accumulated modern dirt. We a lot of times don't take things clean to be fresh. Even this could have been cleaned a lot farther. It was just that top layer of dirt and grime that's removed. It's that a lot of that it adds to the age, the patina, the history. We retain all of that. It's really case by case. And missing or damaged feathers or feathers that have been grazed by insects, we would never consider replacing, filling, just making sure they're stable and able to preserve long term. So it's very much a case by case. A painting in a museum or a very, pristine decorative art piece will make it look as pristine as possible. But it's always dependent on its story and working and not making that decision ourselves, but doing that in collaboration with the client as well. So, anything else? I happen to have brochures about MAC, and also it does include information on if you ever feel like making a donation. All of those donations go towards our educational programming and the overall long-term preservation of works of art and cultural material. I'll have them at the luncheon as well.